Thanks, Kara. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar. Our webinar today is hosted by NCSL's Natural Resource and Infrastructure Committee and is part of the committee's 2015 Spring Webinar Series. For a complete schedule and registration, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. My name is Ben Hush, the Committee Director for the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee, and I will be moderating today's webinar where we will explore how states and the federal government are dealing with the crisis in transportation funding, from the impact of the Great Recession to increasing fuel economy and challenges presented by a static revenue mechanism. This is an issue facing both state, federal, and local governments. Today we will hear directly from a Georgia legislator about the transportation funding bill they approved earlier this year, as well as review the latest in transportation funding across all 50 states and the federal government. However, before we begin, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources. You can also download the webinar and slides right now by clicking on the Media Library button in the upper right-hand corner that is yellow and blue. Our presenters will be answering questions after all presentations. Please type your questions in the question box on the left side of the screen at any time during the webinar. I will be monitoring them and will moderate the Q&A at the end. As everyone who has signed on to today's webinar is involved or interested in the issue of transportation funding, I want to take a quick second and make a plug for NCSL's 2015 Legislative Summit in Seattle, Washington, August 3rd through the 6th. On August 5th, we will be hosting a deep dive session on transportation funding where we will help legislators and legislative staff create a roadmap to a sound transportation plan that creates sustainable revenue, prepares for the future, as well as meets a state's immediate transportation needs. I hope everyone can join us in Seattle. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Representative Terry England of Georgia's 116th District. Representative England hails from Auburn, Georgia, which is about 40 miles northwest of Atlanta. He is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee and member of NCSL's NRI Committee. He was a sponsor of House Bill 170, which was the legislature's transportation funding bill passed earlier this year. Representative England will give us an overview of what's in the bill, how it made it through the legislature, as well as the need for this bill in Georgia. Representative England, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody from the great state of Georgia. Glad to have you here, and glad to have an opportunity to share with you just a little bit about House Bill 170. To give you a little background on our need to do something to catch up with our infrastructure needs here in Georgia, the last couple of years, we've only been able to repave about 2% of our lane miles on our state highways. So if a child graduated from high school today, then the road in front of their house was paved upon their graduation, it would be roughly about 10 or 15 years after their retirement before it would see a new coat of asphalt. So that kind of gives you a mind picture of the condition we were in as far as finances goes toward paying for just the maintenance and upkeep of our infrastructure here in the state. Currently, we're at about a 55% reliance on federal funds and 45% on state funds to do our road maintenance and building projects. Under the new bill, that federal threshold will be lowered to about 25%, with 75% then being state funds. One of the things that we realized over the past year as we traveled our state and held about 8 or 9 meetings around our state to listen to communities and individuals talk about their infrastructure needs and the things that they were seeing happening is that we were getting further and further behind. Our bridges were getting in worse shape than they've ever been. Our roads were the same. And as we were using federal dollars to rely on for a lot of our construction projects, we were seeing that it was costing us about 40% more on a project when we used federal funds than what it would if we used state funds only. Some of the things that we included in the bill, and it was quite a heavy lift, and my hat goes off to our Transportation Committee Chairman, Jay Roberts, who is the primary sponsor of the bill, and his open door policy for listening to our members, both the majority and minority parties, as they came with concerns or things that they would like to see done a little bit different than the bill started out as. But as our committee that circled the state the year before came together and made our recommendations. There were several things that ultimately wound up in the bill on the House side. As we started out on the House side, we were looking at 29 cents a gallon flat excise tax motor fuel, also 33 cents on diesel fuel. The final bill, as it came back from the Senate and our conference committee worked, established the excise tax at 26 cents on gasoline and 29 cents on diesel fuel. Currently, up until July 1, when this bill will take effect, currently we charge about 7.5 cents excise tax on a gallon of fuel, and the remainder is a 4% state sales tax, 3 cents of which was going toward transportation and 1 cent going to the general fund. So the equivalence of that versus the new program, we're at about 21 cents per gallon right now. We'll be going to about 26 cents per gallon on gasoline. So it's about a nickel increase in the excise tax overall. Also in the bill were a couple of other things that deal with the problem that we've run into as gasoline prices, of course, are continuing to go up. But as we start locking ourselves into a per gallon instead of a per dollar price, you also need to index toward the corporate fuel economy, because you're going to see that the corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE standards, are going to continue to increase over the next several years. So that means that every vehicle on the road will be using less gasoline and thus paying less to use the road system. So we have indexed the excise tax to CAFE standards and to the consumer price index. That will actually phase out. The consumer price index piece will actually phase out July 1 of 2018, but the CAFE standard will remain. In Georgia, we have been offering about a $5,000 tax credit on alternative fuel vehicles. We have eliminated that in this bill, and we have also added a user fee for those vehicles. On private vehicles, $200, and on commercial alternative fuel vehicles, $300, since they were absolutely paying nothing to use our system here in the state. One of the other items that we've looked at, of course, our large trucks are one of the biggest damage causers, or the wear users on the roads. Trucks under 26,000 pounds will be assessed a $50 per year fee. Those over 26,001 pounds will be assessed a $100 per year fee. We also included a $5 per night hotel-motel fee. We found that about 85%, 86% of those individuals using our hotels and motels in the state were out-of-state travelers, so they didn't have a local investment as such on the local level. So we're asking them to pay an additional $5 per night hotel-motel fee. We have seen a little bit of pushback from our hospitality industry on that, but we're continuing to work through that as well. Back several years ago, we had also offered a jet fuel tax exemption when Delta Airlines, which is based here in Georgia, was in bankruptcy. That tax exemption was worth about $30 to $35 million to Delta. We eliminated that in this bill. Since they're back in good shape, we felt like that we could phase that out. All total, we look for this bill in the first year to generate about $900 million in new funding for transportation in our state, which will get us a long ways toward where we need to be. Not exactly where we wanted to be. We wanted to be at about $1.5 billion just to keep up. About $2.5 billion starts getting us ahead a little bit. $5 billion in actual per year need actually got us to where we can catch up and get ahead a little bit. So as you all know that are members of General Assemblies across the country, you always start out with something, and as you go through the negotiations, you kind of wind up having to scale things back accordingly. Our governor was involved in the process, as he had also seen that we have quite a dire need for increased funding in our state. He was a lot of help in the final conference committee between the House and the Senate as we went through those negotiations, and with some of the members that were very uncomfortable. with the bill as it was starting out. And just again, like anything else, the bill winds up looking a good bit different in the end than what you start out with. But you always know that you need to kind of shoot over the target a little bit so that you wind up where when you get to the end, it is meaningful, and what you're going to do is going to make an actual difference. It was one of those issues, of course, that we have quite a few members that are vehemently opposed to doing any sort of tax increases. But as we had traveled the state last year and it became obvious to us that our road conditions were dwindling or getting worse by the month, by the day, because of lack of maintenance and effort, we realized that while we don't necessarily care to raise taxes because it comes out of our pocket just like anyone else, that we really had no option because it was getting to be a safety issue. We have about 2,500 bridges that were structurally deficient in our state that have school buses and families passing over them every day, and it just became to a point that it really wasn't an option to sit back and do nothing. The analogy I used when I spoke to the bill in the well was dealing with that 2% of the lane miles that we've been paving over the last couple of years, and it being a 50-year repaving schedule, that actually by the time that 50th year rolls around, you will not be paving or repaving an asphalt road. You're basically going to be repaving a dirt road because that's the condition that it's going to be back in by the time you get back to that point. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we've done here in Georgia. And Ben, I'll turn it back over to you and hang around to answer questions at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative England. And we did get a couple questions in, so I'll be sure to check back in with you. As a reminder, you can type your question in the chat box at any time, and we will hold them until the end of presentations. Now I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, NCSL's own staff member, Kevin Pula, Policy Associate in NCSL's Transportation Program, and our own in-house expert on all things related to state transportation funding and financing. Kevin's been following all the other state action, which has not been easy given the number of states that have taken up this issue, and he's here to give us an overview on all these bills. So Kevin, with that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. As Ben said, I'm a Policy Associate at NCSL, and I primarily focus on transportation funding and finance. I quickly want to thank Representative England again for joining us and sharing Georgia's experience this year. It goes to show the complexity of the issue and just how many facets the legislators are working to come up with the right mix of revenue sources to meet their infrastructure needs. My role today in the webinar is to provide a broader national snapshot of what happened so far in 2015 in state houses across the nation. Transportation funding has certainly not been the only issue facing lawmakers in this busy year, but it has been an issue that's challenged nearly every state from coast to coast. Currently, 22 states, D.C., and Puerto Rico are still in regular session, and an additional 3 states are in special session. One of these states is Washington, where as we speak, the legislature is trying to finalize the passage of a transportation budget and figure out how to get that through both houses. They just started the first day of the second special session today. Throughout the 2015 sessions, at least 49 states have considered more than 500 bills relating to transportation funding and finance. Legislation has ranged across a broad spectrum of topics, from gas tax increases to electric vehicles, and from tolling to bonding authority. To date, at least 25 states have passed at least 55 relevant bills on these topics. As I and others have discussed before, transportation infrastructure is a top state issue. In addition to the significant amount of legislation considered this year, nearly 750 relevant bills were considered over the previous two years. Prior to the 2015 legislative session, NCSL's Executive Committee named transportation funding, infrastructure, and the Highway Trust Fund the #1 state federal priority. I think you guys are all probably aware of how the Highway Trust Fund worked out this year, and Ben's going to have the pleasure of telling us more about that in a few minutes. But I'll focus on the states for now. With the federal uncertainty, states are facing a future where, along with localities, they might be responsible for an even larger share of the nation's transportation funding. Just this week, Moody's Analytics released a report highlighting the historically low levels of infrastructure spending in the United States. Current infrastructure spending is the lowest as a percent of GDP than any other year dating back to the mid-40s. This chart on the screen from the report shows a decreasing share of federal spending for transportation and water infrastructure. States and localities now provide nearly 80% of all transportation and water infrastructure spending. The transportation funding source that seems to perennially garner the most attention is the gas tax. 2015 has been no different, proving to be a banner year for gas tax increases. It should be noted, gas tax increases are not a panacea, and they're not necessarily the answer for every state. Only about 40% of state-level funding across the country comes from gas taxes, compared to nearly 90% of the federal-level funding. As you'll see on the next slide, states are currently using myriad approaches to fund transportation, gas taxes being just one of them. As you can see on the screen right now, the per capita rate of state and local fuel tax revenue has fallen precipitously in the last 2 decades. This is due to a variety of reasons, including increasing fuel economy, rising construction and maintenance costs, and fixed cent per gallon gas taxes not increasing over time. While not viable or appropriate for every state, many states in recent years have explored gas tax increases and passed relevant legislation. And just recently, Georgia and Iowa became the 12th and 13th state to raise their gas taxes by at least 10 cents since 1993, going to show just how hard it's been to make it significant increases in gas taxes. This map on the screen now shows the 14 states that have passed legislation to increase state gas taxes in the past 3 years. 6 states, Georgia, Iowa, Idaho, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Utah, have done so this year. Breaking from the trend of the past 2 years, only 1 state, Utah, implemented an indexed gas tax designed to track with the economy. In 2013 and 2014, a majority of gas tax increases were designed this way. And additionally, Kentucky and North Carolina enacted legislation in order to curb the effect of falling gas prices on revenue. Both of these states, along with 16 others, have variable rate gas taxes which track with the economy to some degree. Kentucky and North Carolina gas taxes are structured as a percentage of the wholesale price of gas, and so as prices fall, so do revenues. Kentucky moved to tweak their formula this year, while North Carolina replaced their tax with an equivalent cent per gallon tax, which will increase with economic indicators. States have begun to explore ways to create what some call sustainable funding sources. Many experts argue a cent per gallon gas tax is not sustainable for many of the reasons I've discussed so far. Emerging options that states are exploring are tracking with the economy, similar to the index gas taxes just discussed, and capturing all road users, or creating a new funding mechanism altogether, such as a VMT or road usage charge. This word cloud shows the revenue sources that states have used to fund roads, bridges, rail, and transit, with the larger text showing more common revenue sources. As you can see, states use a wide variety of revenue mechanisms. The huge text in the middle tells us that states rely heavily on gas taxes, and we see that by every state levying taxes on gasoline and diesel, and gas taxes provide close to 40% of all revenues for highways, all state revenues for highways. Other revenue sources, from most to least common, include various fees, sales taxes, tolls, general funds, and an assortment of other sources such as congestion pricing and state lotteries. One of these revenue sources that has been in the limelight this year has been electric vehicles. A majority of states provide incentives for electric or hybrid vehicles, and these incentives can range from reduced toll fees to tax rebates or credits for vehicle purchases, to parking discounts, and to reduced inspection fees. Prior to 2015, though, 5 states imposed additional registration fees on hybrid or electric vehicles. Interestingly enough, All 5 of these states also provided incentives to some degree. While experts agree that the current size of the electric vehicle fleet is negligible in terms of impacts on transportation revenues, some legislatures looking towards a future where EVs may one day represent a significant portion of America's vehicles. This year, at least 16 states considered more than 32 bills related to electric vehicles incentives, fees, or taxes on alternative fuels. 3 states passed new fees for electric or hybrid vehicles to bring the total of number of states imposing these fees to 8. These new fees include a $140 fee for electric vehicles and a $75 fee for hybrids in Idaho, a $50 decal required for EVs in Wyoming, and a $200 fee for electric vehicles in Georgia, now the highest in the country. Additionally, as part of their gas tax increases, Iowa and Idaho will now tax alternative fuels at increased rates. Another approach being considered in some states is a vehicle miles traveled tax. In 2015, 12 states considered at least 15 bills related to vehicle miles traveled programs, primarily to study the feasibility of a VMT program. However, so far this year, none have passed. But it is important to talk about what Oregon is trying to do this summer, or is doing this summer. Transportation stakeholders around the country are going to have one eye on Oregon as they roll out their Orgo road usage charge program. In 2013, Oregon enacted high-profile legislation to create the largest proof of concept in the U.S. so far for mileage-based charges. Starting in July this year, Orgo will allow owners of up to 5,000 vehicles to pay a 1.5-cent charge per mile rather than gas taxes. And a couple key provisions included in this program. First, will allow participants will be allowed to choose how they report and pay for miles driven, potentially alleviating any privacy concerns. And another interesting provision that may especially help rural participants like farmers, drivers can also get a refund for miles driven on private property. Gas taxes, electric vehicle fees, and VMT were not the only transportation revenue-related legislation to be considered this year. Other hot topics in state houses included public-private partnerships, tolling, and even bonding. A number of states passed large transportation funding packages which didn't include EVs or gas taxes. Some of these high-profile initiatives include Mississippi, which moved legislation to provide $200 million in bonding for transportation. Similarly, Massachusetts approved a $200 million bond bill for local roads. North Dakota passed a funding package which includes a $450 million for the North Dakota Department of Transportation, and in total $1.1 billion for infrastructure. And Ohio enacted a $7 billion two-year transportation budget, which provides $5.9 billion to the state DOT. It was not all success for transportation investment advocates this year. Key pieces of legislation failed to pass in a number of states. For example, the Colorado legislature did not approve a $3.5 billion bond package for transportation. Michigan voters defeated an 11-bill transportation funding package, which was poised to raise billions of dollars annually for transportation. Minnesota legislators failed to see eye to eye on a long-term transportation funding package and instead passed a 2-year extension of current programs. In that state, the governor's proposal was supported by the Democrats, and it involved tax and fee increases, while the Republican-backed proposal would have provided funding transfers to support transportation and not increase taxes. Also of note, proposals to increase the gas tax were killed or have failed to move in at least 10 states this year. So to wrap this all up, state legislators have been busy in 2015, considered a significant number of bills relating to transportation, and while many states moved to increase taxes and fees, other states sought out solutions with alternative means. So before I pass the mic off to Ben to talk about the federal issues, I'd like to highlight a few of NCSL's resources and other topics that our transportation program covers. In addition to transportation funding and finance, our program covers traffic safety, distracted and impaired driving, autonomous vehicles, public transportation, bike ped issues, access to mobility, aviation, car riding or car ride sharing, and many others. NCSL also tracks pending legislation from all 50 states through our Transportation Funding and Finance database. All of the bills we referenced today can be located there. We also have databases on traffic safety, transportation access and mobility, and 911, all of which are available on our website. Additionally, NCSL provides no-cost technical assistance to state legislative entities upon invitation, and we respond to individual requests for information. So I want to thank you for listening to this portion. I certainly hope it proves useful. Remember, you can use the chat box in the bottom corner to submit any questions that we'll discuss at the end. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ben.
Thanks, Kevin. Really, really helpful overview. I'm sure all of this has made for a pretty hectic first half of 2015. As Kevin said, before we move on to the Q&A, I did just want to take a couple minutes to discuss the latest status of federal transportation funding. So for those that haven't been following the news the past couple weeks, federal transportation funding and authorization faces a coming fiscal cliff. The current Federal Surface Transportation Law, MAP 21, or extensions of it, expires on July 31st, 2015. Last week, the Senate, following the House, passed a 2-month extension of authorization. The 2-month extension did not include any new funding or an extension of funding. The reason for that being back basically about the same time last year, 2014, Congress approved a 10-month extension, which included a little bit more than $10 billion in funding, and that actually lasted. It was initially expected to last only until May 31st, but actually it's lasted a little bit longer than that, and so this 2-month extension did not require any additional funding. However, the question about what will happen come July 31st is still up in the air, and I will touch on kind of a little bit about that in a second. This next slide, as you can see, actually comes to us from a group known as SHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. We refer to it as kind of a highway trust fund ticker, and it kind of shows, as of the end of April, the balance of the highway account within the highway trust fund. And the red line going across kind of the middle of that chart is what is known as the minimum prudent balance, and what that refers to is that the U.S. Department of Transportation, which operates reimbursements from the Highway Trust Fund, does not really want the balance level to go below $4 billion, just especially during the summer, to ensure that reimbursement requests from states do not put the balance of the Highway Trust Fund below $0, and legally that actually is not possible. And so should the balance of the Highway Trust Fund fall below that $4 billion, Secretary Fox announced last year, and he's also announced earlier this year, that the DOT would have to take some special actions. The primary special action that they would have to take would be delaying and potentially, if the balance level grew low enough, delaying reimbursements to states. And that would put the state in the position of either having to delay its payments to contractors or rating other funds in the states, be it their reserve funds, to pay those contractors. So Kevin touched on a couple of these issues that I'm going to talk about over the next couple of slides, and it's really kind of the reason for the declining balance in the Highway Trust Fund. As I'm sure most folks are familiar with, the per gallon gas tax has not been increased since 1993. You can see what the past 20-plus years has done to that via inflation, and what it will continue to do if that rate is not increased. Another major reason for the issues with the Highway Trust Fund is the decline in vehicle miles traveled. You can see a steady increase throughout the 80s and 90s and, kind of first 2/3 of the 2000s prior to the Great Recession. And then about 2008, you can kind of see a slight dip with kind of a U-shaped curve following that. And so while total VMT is likely to soon exceed 2008 levels, VMT per capita is still below its high. And as Representative England mentioned, with what Georgia did, future CAFE standards are also likely to impact highway trust fund revenues. As you can see, this chart from the Department of Energy shows CAFE standards starting in 1978 to current standards through 2025. And you can see kind of starting in 2011, 2016, and then 2025, the major jump between 2016 and 2025 and how if we are not driving significantly more, the amount of gallons purchased will go down because cars will be getting more miles per gallon. This slide actually respective to just Florida, not the federal government, but I think it makes kind of really hits this point home. As you can see, the blue line shows state fuel tax forecast without increasing miles per gallon, but the red shows what the state would take in fuel tax revenue with increasing miles per gallon. So you can see the difference right now is not so significant, but as we move further out into the future, it becomes a growing and growing problem. So this chart from the Congressional Research Service just kind of puts what I just talked about into numbers, with highway trust fund revenue kind of stabilizing at about $39 billion. And so even though, what I talked about with a kind of static vehicle miles traveled, increasing fuel economy, given the growth in the U.S. population and the growth of the economy, we would see essentially a static amount of revenue, $39 billion. However, highway trust fund outlays, if they kind of maintain their pace with inflation and the federal government doesn't cut back on what it's currently spending, we would continue to see a slight increase. And so over a 6-year total, there's about a $90 billion difference between what the highway trust fund is bringing in versus what it's spending. This next slide really just shows that in line graph form. As you can see, kind of starting in about 2008, outlays started to vastly increase over receipts, and that problem is just going to get worse and worse as we go out into the future. So then how then did Congress kind of maintain a positive highway trust fund balance with the difference between revenues and outlays? As you can see, since 2008, they provided $63 billion in transfers to the highway trust fund, most of those primarily coming from the general fund, some of those coming from the Leaking Underground Storage Tank Trust Fund, which is acronized on this chart as LUST. And then this is probably actually one of my favorite charts, although it's again from SHTO. And it might be a little bit difficult to read, so I apologize, and it's really because there are so many options on here. But if you download the presentation in PDF form, it's actually much easier to read. And just as a reminder, you can do that kind of in the upper right-hand corner. It's a little yellow and blue kind of button. If you click on that, you can download the slides. But getting back to this slide, it's what SHTO refers to as technically feasible revenue options. So it includes everything from an increase in the gas tax, an increase in sales tax, increase in certain motor vehicle fees, and really kind of shows what, or I should say, the amount of revenue that such an increase would bring given its contribution to the Highway Trust Fund. This slide takes that previous slide and puts that kind of into a, not chart form, but another way of showing it. As you can see, the x-axis is economic considerations of the options on the previous slide, and the y-axis is kind of implementation issues. So on the left, as a vehicle miles traveled fee, as Kevin talked about with Oregon. In the middle, you'll see a sales tax on diesel and gas. Slightly below that, you'll see a motor fuels tax. And all the way on the right of the x-axis, you'll see an income tax. So getting back to MAP 21 reauthorization and where it stands. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Highway Trust Fund, or I should say authorization for federal transportation programs and funding expires on July 31st. And so while it remains up in the air as to whether Congress will pass a long-term bill or another short-term extension, in the Senate, The issue is there are essentially four committees of jurisdiction. You have the Environment and Public Works Committee, which really deals with highway, roads, and bridges, what most people think of when it comes to surface transportation. However, you also have three other committees. The Senate Banking Committee, which most importantly deals with public transportation funding. You also have the Senate Commerce Committee, which deals with highway safety, truck safety. And then finally, you have the Senate Finance Committee, which most importantly deals with the revenues and any offsets that would be required. And so all of these committees would have to approve essentially a different title that would all go into a long-term bill. Most of these committees have held hearings in this session of Congress, and I'm happy to say that the EPW Committee has scheduled a markup for its portion of the bill on June 24th. The House is a little bit less complex. You really have two different committees of jurisdiction. You have the Transportation Infrastructure Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. The House Transportation Infrastructure Committee has held a number of hearings over the past couple months on federal transportation. And the Ways and Means Committee, although I haven't seen a date for it, there have been reports that it does plan to hold a hearing sometime in June or July on the issue of federal transportation funding. So what are some potential funding options that the federal government might, or that are out there right now? You know, kind of the most common one that was part of the extension passed in 2014 are temporary pay-fors. Just to give you an example, the 2014 bill used a number of different methods. It used the Lost Trust Fund. It also kind of two provisions unrelated to surface transportation was it dedicated future customs revenues. And then it also dedicated, I should say, revenues from the general fund, but these revenues were freed up by essentially an aspect dealing with pensions because interest rates are so low right now and they are expected to rise. That requires the federal government to set aside more, I should say, more funds in the present, but by kind of balancing the expected rise in pension rates. That allows the federal government to set aside less funding currently, and so that funding that was expected to be set aside was diverted to the Highway Trust Fund. The second bullet there is the Grow America Act repatriation. There are a couple bills in Congress right now that deal with kind of the overall idea of repatriation and tying it to tax reform. Some of those bills are a mandatory repatriation. Some of them are voluntary. You've seen conflicting statements, one from Senator Orrin Hatch, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which, you know, he doesn't really seem to be a huge fan of repatriation outside of tax reform. You know, and getting tax reform done in such a short period of time obviously has a number of issues that are not related to transportation. But that is, you know, an issue that a number of congressional leaders continue to highlight. The third bullet on there is Corker-Murphy, and that actually refers to a bill that was introduced by Senators Corker and Murphy actually last Congress, which would raise the federal gas tax 12 cents, so 2 cents, or excuse me, 6 cents every 2 years, and then index it to inflation. So just, you know, real quickly, obviously, the surface transportation issue, Highway Trust Fund, is a major aspect of federal transportation, but just a couple other bills that are likely to deal with federal transportation, not necessarily surface transportation, but that will, you know, kind of be in the news, are obviously the federal budget, which will come up later this year, along with the debt limit, and then Amtrak reauthorization, which, given the unfortunate news of earlier this month, is likely to be a major issue for Congress later this year, as well as FAA reauthorization. So it's not just surface transportation in the overall world of federal transportation, unfortunately. I just want to kind of close with this last slide, which is from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, powers to the federal government, and specifically to establish post offices and post roads, kind of giving the federal government kind of power over not only interstate commerce, but obviously the roads that are used for that. So this slide, just if you have any questions after this presentation, please feel free to give myself or Kevin an email. But with that, why don't we go ahead and move into the question and answer portion. But I do also, just real quick, want to thank Representative England and Kevin for joining us today. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the box on the left-hand side. But the first question, Representative England, actually goes to you.
Okay.
And you mentioned that, what Georgia maybe needs versus or I should say the amount of funding is not necessarily, the total that the final bill was going to raise. So do you think that there will be a push for additional investment in the next session?
No, I don't really look for that. With the CAFE indexing and the CPI indexing, as those two triggers kick in, I think we will see the amount start to grow. And as we start pulling some of the projects off the list as we start getting them done, I think there'll be a happy spot somewhere in there. We've got a good bit of bonded indebtedness where we did kind of a fast forward program several years ago. And once we reach about 2021, 2022, some of that debt service comes off, and those funds then can be used toward highway maintenance and construction as well. So I don't really see us looking to go back in and look for anything else. One thing I did fail to mention, we did bond $100 million in general obligation bonds for bridges to go on and kickstart that pretty quick and get some of that work done, and did bond about $50 million for transit. That will go out to about 126 or 127 transit agencies across our state for some infrastructure needs that they have as well.
Great. This next question, again, probably for you, Representative England, but Kevin, I think you might also want to mention anything. Really, the link between CAFE and kind of indexing, is that, in your research, Representative England, is that something that's unique to Georgia? Have you seen that in other states? Was there another state that you maybe kind of saw that in and, was that's a great idea, let's use it here. Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
No, I'm sure there's some other states that probably do it. We just got to looking at it and realized our 7.5 cents excise tax was set in 1971 and had not been adjusted since then. We realized that the fuel economy average at that point was probably about 8 or 10 miles to the gallon on a corporate average, and realizing now that we're, I guess, in the mid-20s, somewhere thereabouts, and realized that, my personal experience, going from an F-150 2003 model F-150 to a 2013 Ford Explorer, I'm using half of the motor fuel or half the gasoline I was using because my mileage is double what it was. And so just realizing that we were seeing the same amount of miles traveled, but as the vehicles get newer, then the gas tax they were paying was being cut basically in half or maybe even less. And so I'm sure, like I said, there's some other states that have done it, but I'm not saying we're the sharpest pencils in the drawers either, but we realized that there was a need to recognize that corporate average fuel economy was increasing.
Great, Kev. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, off the top of my head, I don't know of any other states that use that approach. It's certainly, I would say, probably cutting edge. It really gets to, as Representative England just said, it gets to this trying to solve the issue of these fuel efficiency standards that are lowering revenues for some states. So,
great, thanks. And Rep. England, I think this might be the final question for you. So, was there, and you kind of already touched on this, but just to make sure I ask all the questions that were submitted, was there a specific reason that the bill, kind of ends the CPI indexing in 2018, but continues on the CAFE indexing after that?
Well, CPI, as we looked at two different CPIs, the Consumer Price Index, then there's another CPI called the Construction Price Index. And as we looked at both of them, we realized that probably in the outlying years that it would probably start escalating considerably, and we didn't want to get you can always come back in and trigger that back in if we need to, but we didn't want to get to the point at some point that it just took off and started putting an excess burden on our citizens. So we wanted to scale it back. CAFE is going to be kind of a slight increase as time goes along, but nothing like what CPI has the potential to be.
Great, thanks. Kevin, I'm pretty sure this next question is for you, and I'm kind of going to paraphrase it here, but of the states where we've seen a transportation funding package, has there been any kind of consistency in terms of a split legislature versus the governor, in terms of party, or does it really seem to be kind of contained to those states where the governor and the legislature are of the same party?
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see over the last, I mean, it's not like we've only seen Republican-controlled legislatures or Democratic-controlled legislatures moving these packages. It's really been like a bipartisan issue that the legislatures are facing and tackling. So the first one that comes to mind, or the most prominent one, would be Nebraska this year. The legislature passed the gas tax increase. The governor vetoed it, and then pretty quickly the legislature overrode that veto to put the gas tax in. Now that state's unique because they only have one house in the legislature, so that might be a little different than all the other states have too, but that's the one that jumps to mind with the governor and the legislature kind of at odds.
Great, thanks. The last question right now, but if there are any others, please feel free to type them into the box, is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which I guess which was addressed to me, was whether or not to expect Congress to pass a long-term federal transportation plan. And I wouldn't say it's 0%. I would probably put it below 50%. With the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee having its markup for its portion on June 24th is definitely a good sign. We haven't really seen any indication on the House's plan. So whether or not the House and Senate can come together by the end of July, given where current authorization and funding will last until, I think that's a really good question that I unfortunately don't have the exact answer to. But I would, if I had to pick a number, I would probably say somewhere around 33, so maybe, a third. And taking a quick look over at the question box, I don't see any other questions, so I'd like to once again extend a big thank you to Kevin and Representative England for joining us today, and of course, thanks to the attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation will be made available. You'll receive an email shortly about how to access these resources and register for any upcoming webinars in the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee Spring Webinar Series. Thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and I hope to see everyone in Seattle. Have a great weekend, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.